Jürgen Wiemann, EADI.
Thank you. I'm Jürgen Wiemann, the Vice President of EADI. And I thank you very much for undermining possibly simplistic thinking that rising inequality is related to populism and the backlash against globalization. I try to make up my mind what you show us. Possibly the picture in the US and the same in the UK is that those regions, London, the West Coast and the East Coast in the US, are more globalized than the rest of the US, the flyover states and the northern England. Now, obviously, those regions that are open to globalization are more in favor of the Democrats or in favor of remaining inside the EU, whereas those regions delinked from globalization or relatively delinked from globalization and showing a higher degree of equality, according to your statistics, are in favor of populism and Trump and Brexit. I try to understand that. So should we neglect inequality, rising inequality, because do we have to accept it as a feature of globalization, even if we have some concern as social scientists and socially concerned people? But these regions seem to thrive and seem to vote for those. I mean, I think the majority here in this audience would prefer to vote for the Democrats, maybe for your side of the Democrats and not for Hillary Clinton. But is that the point? Should we at least be more relaxed with inequality rising?
I would argue that if you go to Detroit or Milwaukee or Cleveland, Youngstown, Ohio, I was the McGovern campaign coordinator in the 19th Congressional District, Youngstown, Ohio in 1972. You're looking at the effects of globalization. That's the steel towns, that's the auto factories, that's the, in Milwaukee, that's the machine tool shops. Right? And over 40 years, these industries, which form the backbone of the American industrial working class and the Democratic Party, United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers, the machinists, very powerful at one point, have been wiped out. They are the principal victims in the advanced countries of the globalization process. There are two aspects of this. One is that they've simply been replaced by the Japanese, the Germans, the Koreans, now the Chinese. And the other is that they've been undermined, but not entirely replaced, by the influx of foreign direct investment, so that the assembly plants, which used to be in Detroit, are now in southern Ohio and other places where they are operating considerably lower labor costs. So either way, this area has been experiencing globalization. The difference is that in the East Coast and the West Coast, you've got the sectors which have been winning. Finance on the East Coast, insurance, Connecticut, higher education, scientific research in Massachusetts, and technology on the West Coast. Aerospace in Washington, software in Washington, the Silicon Valley phenomenon. Right? That's where the very high incomes are. And that's where you get the urban centers, where the dominant political force is high-income professionals, as well as a large immigrant community, which is much less prominent in the deindustrializing areas because they're not so attractive places to go. It's not where the income flows are from which you can live as an immigrant. So that's why what I see going on. The globalization is a comprehensive phenomenon, but you have two very different attitudes toward it, depending upon whether you've benefited or you've lost. And the reality in the United States is that there is a disproportionate electoral valence and weighting on the rural regions, which are predominantly losers. So they have in this predominantly relatively lost out. And so they have much more weight. California only has 2 senators. 21 states that don't have the population of California, and each of them have 2 senators. Right? They don't together have the population of California. The House of Representatives has been redistricted in such a way as to overweight the rural and conservative districts because they put all of the minority voters into Democratic districts so that they don't spread out and influence the vote in other districts. Electoral college, similarly, same reason as the Senate, is weighted toward so it tips the balance of power in favor of those who are playing on the anger, which is justified anger. And that, I think, is you see the same thing in France, the eastern France, the National Front areas. Same thing in the Midlands and the north of England, the Brexit areas. It represents a failure of policy to address the regional aspect. People can always leave. They do. They go to New York. They can live good lives there. They go to California. They come to Texas. But the people who are left behind are the people who still vote in those regions. And if you don't address that problem, you are going to end up with a political divide which gets larger and larger to the point where it becomes unbridgeable. And that, I think, is happening in the United States. It is happening, and the Democratic Party has not really addressed this problem, come to grips with it. It's also obviously behind with what was the remarkable disaster of the Brexit vote, where people voted for something whose implications they couldn't understand because it had never been explained. They were simply told by the high and mighty that this would be a terrible thing, and the high and mighty were unable to relate it to their interests or to respond to what those interests actually were.
Thank you so much. We allow for the very last question, a very short one, and with a short answer, and then we proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have 2 small questions. Also on the last slide, if I understood you correctly, you looked at the voting pattern compared to the change in inequality.
Yes.
Did you also look at? Did you also compare with the absolute levels of inequality,
yes.
And would the picture look different then? And my other question is: did this measure of inequality include the capital income or not?
The answer to both questions is yes. This is. We did do the levels. I use the change because it's a little more dramatic. Maybe it's the top 10 or 12 states at levels. But since the states were much more equal 25 years ago, the change and the levels are highly correlated. In terms of capital income, it's not a tax-based income measure, so it doesn't capture realized capital gains. Nothing captures unrealized. No data captures unrealized capital gains. What it does capture is earnings by sector and state. And so you have a great deal of income in the U.S. in the advanced sectors and the financial sectors, which is the result of stock options realizations or the payout from venture capital, right, in a startup firm. So, and that is registered and taxed as it's registered as payroll taxes income. We are capturing that. So it's what our measures are going to be very closely associated with the tax measure of capital gains. That includes capital gains. And actually, an interesting detail. We've done this analysis across counties in the U.S. There are 3,150 counties in the country. And if you look at the period from 1994 to 2000, the internet information technology boom, if you remove 5 counties from the data, then the rise in inequality that occurs in that period drops by half. Right? The 5 counties are, you guessed it, Manhattan, New York, 3 counties in Northern California, Santa Clara, San Francisco, and is it San Marino? I think that's the 3rd, and King County, Washington, Microsoft. So that's where the stratospheric incomes captured in very, very small part of the country. And much of the rest of the country didn't experience the dramatic rise of inequality. It really is a phenomenon. Rich people concentrate in very small places. That's where they report their capital gains and their venture capital incomes.
Professor James Galbraith, thank you so much for giving us an excellent kickstart for this conference. You have provided us with a backdrop that is useful for all of us, independent of disciplines.
I do want to call attention to the multinational character of my team. A Korean, a French, Polish, Argentine, Iranian, and Chinese.
There we are.